we are.
Here we are.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for the last track session on the final day of Shoptalk Europe 2023. I'm Joe Laszlo. I'm a Vice President of Content on the Shoptalk team. Joining me on stage are Krystina Gustafson, our SVP of Content, and Ben Miller, our Director of Original Content. And we like to take one of our track sessions at the end of every show just to kind of talk a little bit about what we've heard over the past few days. They have been jam-packed days full of learning, full of content, full of networking, full of connections. Some of you may have actually spent the last few days just focused on the food, which also is something else. And in that case, if you're here because you need to kind of come up with a report back for your boss when you get back to the office, we will help. We will provide some insights into what everybody has been talking about at the show. So, by the way, we will also be asking for some of your insights as well. We use this as like the kickoff for our learning from the audience, what we should be doing the next time, what you liked, and what we could be doing better. So have your phones at the ready. There will be some polling built into the next 38 minutes and 52 seconds. So what we want to do is talk a little bit about what we thought coming in. We designed these agendas deliberately, and so there's a few things that we kind of planned as we kind of built the Shoptalk Europe agenda this year. Then we'll talk about what we've heard over the last few days, 6 big things that we'll try to provide some concrete examples for. And then again, throughout, we will be asking you for your thoughts as well. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because we have a lot to talk about, but our big themes for Shoptalk Europe this year: 1, best-in-class shopper engagement. What really makes shoppers excited, whether online or in store? What gets them interested in your brands and kind of looking at you and wanting to purchase from you? Emerging channels, what's new with the metaverse, what's new with AI, all the other new ways that people are shopping today. Outstanding store experiences. Again, if the store never really went away, what makes a store experience today one that consumers will seek out and come back to time and again? Tech investments, and particularly technology investments that help a business grow more efficient, as opposed to the blue sky things that may or may not pay off 5 years from now. I think this is an environment and a moment when companies are really looking at things that will improve their bottom line in some way in the shorter term. And then finally, how organizations are evolving, how companies themselves are changing to take down silos, to be more adaptable, to be more resilient. So those were the 5 big themes that we planned, built into the agenda for this year. I want to stop right now, so get your phones ready. We will do our first survey. I want to know from you all, what were your priorities coming into Shoptalk Europe this year? Uh-oh, that should not be happening. We may not do Slido this go around, because this should actually show the poll results right now. Can we maybe try restarting PowerPoint? Sometimes that fixes the problem. In the meantime, we can go forward and start talking about some of the substantive things that we have been talking about the last several days. And I think I would be remiss if we didn't start with the biggest topic of the last several days, which is AI and data getting ever larger. So let's maybe talk a little bit about some of what we've heard the last few days about artificial intelligence, data analytics, machine learning. I don't know if either of you want to kick it off. I could start with a more directed question, which is generative AI. What is it anyway?
Well, I guess I feel like generative AI is the buzzword of the year, but hopefully a little bit of a different buzzword than we had been hearing potentially when we were thinking about the metaverse and something that was said to be a decade or so off. It feels like generative AI is here and it's real, and people are already experimenting with it, using it, and finding some real success points. I think coming in, really cognizant of the opportunity, I'm personally very excited about it because I feel like it helps businesses operate more efficiently and just, quite frankly, do things at scale that they were never able to do previously, whether it's product content, whether it's product imagery. There are just so many applications. It goes all the way into supply chain. I mean, you could sort of go on and on there. But I think what really stood out to me was companies today are now starting to think about the implications of this and what it really sort of means to be responsible. I think oftentimes when you hear about responsible AI, you think about it in terms of being inclusive, but really some of the headlines that we've seen recently coming from Samsung Samsung with their, I guess it's kind of a data breach, not technically a data breach, but companies putting sensitive information into OpenAI models. And there's been a lot of buzz and conversation just about, how you can make sure when you are working with these types of solutions, you're doing it responsibly and really just kind of doing the typical vendor selection process and due diligence about, what data you're giving it, how that's being then shared potentially other places. I think those are the real critical conversations that I heard bubbling up quite a bit here.
I mean, I've heard quite a spectrum on it over the last few days. Some of you may have been in the conversation that we had on the Teal stage with Alan Bain from H&M, who's just kind of transforming roles, previously Chief Technology Officer. And he made the bold statement of this is kind of the third world-changing digital technology. The first being the internet, the second being mobile phones that put the internet in your pocket, and the third being generative AI.
It was supposed to be the metaverse.
Yeah, last year.
We'll get to that.
So, as we were saying, peak hype curve. So we've heard some very peak hype curve comments. We've also heard some people saying, we haven't got non-generative AI sorted yet. So let's take one step at a time and let's really understand what it is to unlock. And I think we just had some great honesty for those of you who are just over in the Lime stage with me half an hour ago with Elodie from Carrefour, who is Chief Digital Officer, where she was very honest and saying we just don't know what generative AI is going to do for us. We know it's going to be important. We know it's going to be exciting. We're investing in it. We're signing partnerships in it. But we actually don't know what it's going to do. So we think it's going to do some really tangible things that are really important for retailers and brands, like make things more efficient, make things quicker, and engage with customers better. And all of those are really important things for any retailer. How that looks like, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, no, I thought going all the way back to the opening keynote, Robert Gens from Zalando kind of talked about ChatGPT and maybe AI a little bit more broadly than the generative AI specifically, but really kind of leaning on those sorts of technologies to push fashion retail, like almost double its market share in the next several years. So I think that's very telling, but at the same time, there was an AI session yesterday where, on the one hand, we heard from Google, who had like amazing demonstrations of what generative AI can do, kind of generating music, even generating video these days. That's really, really kind of neat. But on the other hand, Jerome, the Chief Digital Officer at Decathlon, was sort of more cautious about kind of really being focused on what are the tangible KPIs I can measure if I invest in this technology, just like any other technology, and what are the challenges? What am I going to have to do in order to be transparent with my customers about what kind of data I'm using and what it's going to do for the business and for customers and partners. So we have the survey working right now, and I see a ton of you have already voted. The question was, coming into Shoptalk Europe 3.5 days ago, what topics were top of mind for you? And you can see based on your votes, retail technologies first, very close second, generative AI, omnichannel and whatever omnichannel is becoming, and then future of the store. And I think it's a pretty telling, pretty good list, pretty decent set of priorities. So thank you for that. If you're curious, we asked the same question at Shoptalk in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and this was how things stacked up. By a wide margin, generative AI and artificial intelligence more broadly was the thing that people were most excited about, unified commerce being second, retail technologies being third. So similar in terms of what's on the list, but kind of quantitatively a little bit different. I have a very similar but slightly different question to ask next, which is, now that Shoptalk Europe is coming to an end, what was the thing that you learned the most about or found the most interesting? So it's the same list of things, but like now 3.5 days later and wiser, what was the most interesting thing or most important thing you heard? You can pick up to 3 here.
I think one of the things that I'm struck by is it's only actually been 2.5 days, Joe. It may feel longer.
It feels like, I don't know, I feel like Shoptalk days are kind of like dog years.
Yeah, I think Stephanie Fairman, yeah. It's interesting to watch it in real time.
Yeah, I could just... So I think maybe we biased you all by talking about it first, but clearly there has been a lot of conversation about what AI is doing these days and where its potential opportunities and challenges lie. So
and I think that's a very fair reflection to many of the conversations I've heard. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. unified commerce second, retail technologies third, future of the store and retail media networks kind of tied. We'll come back to retail media networks in a little while. So thanks for voting. Here's the US results, kind of similar to you all, like where generative AI is up in the 60s. It was very much the same at Shoptalk in Las Vegas about a month ago. And again, I think priorities are similar on both sides of the Atlantic, even if the actual numbers are a little bit different. It's interesting to me that like inflation in the economy was a fairly big concern for our American attendees several weeks ago, but it became less of a concern as Shoptalk went on.
Yes.
So interesting stuff. So let's talk about the other 5-ish big things that I think have been themes throughout the track sessions in the main stage over the course of the last several days. We just talked about AI and very big data, moving beyond omnichannel, purpose and leadership, changing corporate relationships, what's going on with the investment environment right now, and then kind of a catch-all, like all the other cool technologies that people have been talking about and excited about for the last few days. So we'll go through those one at a time. We won't be able to spend too much time on any one of them because this is only 40 minutes total and you all want to go and have some kava, and we kind of do too. We need to have kava up here next year. But let's start talking. So I think we've already covered AI and very big data in a decent way. I think, again, kind of there's a lot of talk about the need for guardrails and kind of ways to make generative AI solutions not kind of fully open-ended and unpredictable, but a little more kind of brand safe before people are 100% comfortable using them. I will point out that our design team also used some generative AI. All of the pictures in the zeitgeist were generated by prompts. So that is not a real woman. Those glasses are not available. That is not a shopping experience in Barcelona, but it could be.
Yeah, but I would also like to point out they took several iterations of trying to get the sentiment right. Our first one on retailer and brand relationships was quite awkward. It was almost as if they were embracing. So
yeah. So okay. So let's move on to topic number 2, which is beyond omnichannel. It's been a little thing of mine to try to kind of get people to stop talking about or using that word. I think omnichannel as an idea is more important now than ever before, but omnichannel as a word has this kind of connotation that it's a bit in the past. So we've been using the phrase unified retail or unified commerce within Shoptalk and on some of our track sessions, but
yeah.
Ben, maybe I'll start with you and kind of if you want to kind of say a word about what you've been hearing about omnichannel the last few days.
I think it's a really interesting conversation that has been developing, and it's less about the language, but that's important. It's more about the thought process and where in any retailer's or brand's thinking they're putting the shopper. So kind of omnichannel has become, first of all, people hate the word, but really it's because it still talks to channel management. So whether you're thinking about managing people in the online channel or physical, or if you're in the CPG world, we're looking at the grocery channel versus wholesale channel. It's moving beyond that to actually Unified puts the customer at the heart of it and thinking about the entire customer journey. And that's increasingly important for brands because brands are seeing this as an opportunity to own the path to purchase. When we talk about retail media, it's quite low on the list. Retail media is all about monetizing and taking value out of the path to purchase if you're a retailer. Well, if you're a brand, if you've got that path to purchase, you're bringing people in for your social, for your wide marketing activity, and then you're taking them to a fulfillment agnostic approach, whether it's a marketplace or a selection of retail. You are controlling that path to purchase. And that puts the shopper at the heart of it. It changed the balance slightly. And I can see more and more people think about how do we get beyond that, how do we make sure that as a brand owner we can be present and then we take people through on the journey. And then the technologies we heard about on the tech track to make it happen, which is a very different, it's the same principle, how do I manage across being able to get my products everywhere, but actually it's a very different application of it and real momentum behind that.
Yeah. I think one of the things I've thought was interesting the last few days is kind of an omni-channel conversation that actually places stores for those retailers that have them at kind of the heart of the omni-channel experience. And I think, to be really unified commerce, like there can't be, all the different channels that you use have to be sort of co-equal, but I think for those retailers that do have stores, one of the forward-thinking things we think is, I heard was, kind of not saying that, mobile is the glue in our omni-channel strategy or we're e-com first, but like really the store is at the heart of things and, kind of everything else kind of ties into and supports a store experience or an experience that may touch on the store. It may not, but some of what you were talking about on stage about the Zara example of Zara's flagships and the way they leverage the mobile app to kind of complement the store experience, I think is one potential example of that. Your conversation with Parag from IKEA,
I was just going to bring that up.
Well.
I thought it was really interesting, and it's interesting as well because he's the chief digital officer, and how much of his presentation was focused on the physical store, I think is just kind of very indicative of this very topic. But it was really fascinating to hear about how they're really sort of, I wouldn't say moving away, but diversifying from the big blue box store that everyone is familiar with from IKEA, and really launching more small format stores and thinking about the role that technology has to play in order to make that store experience still feel very much like IKEA in a smaller setting, which leans on things like augmented reality. It leans on your store associates to really sort of tell the story better. So really interesting things that they're early stages in there, and it'll be interesting to see how they scale.
Yeah, for sure. I thought the Printemps presentation was just kind of really inspiring as far as like what an omni-channel experience can be when it's really beautiful and well thought out. But again, their flagship stores are really kind of vital to that. And I think it was one of the things John Mark said, like they can't compete against like Farfetch as a pure play e-com player. What do they have that Farfetch does? Well, Farfetch has a store or two, but like their flagship stores are something that an e-com pure player doesn't have.
Right.
I think one of the things that's been really interesting during this conversation is some of the technologies that are powering this. It's almost their second wave. So electronic shelf edge ticketing is a great example. We're now seeing a second peak of interest because it enables it to connect in a seamless way to be able to power store pickup or flexible pricing, et cetera, et cetera. And the other one is RFID. So RFID tags are now enabling smart stores. And again, we had interest in RFID, really dropped away. Now it's coming back, whether that's, Alan from H&M talked about it. We talked about the COS store, completely powered by RFID. And RFID was interesting. It then became a supply chain play. Now it's right there in bringing together the stores. And I think that's it's kind of interesting to think what the next tech that will drive that will be.
Absolutely, right. QR codes much the same. They were sort of, everybody had wrote them off, then kind of really the pandemic is what in the West kind of drove them to be everywhere, and now the consumer knows what a QR code is and eagerly kind of scan something to learn more about a product.
I would say, though, the funny thing is that sometimes the opposite is happening, right? We were all so hot on frictionless checkout for a minute, and it feels like a lot of companies, Amazon included, are sort of pulling back on that experience. So it may be kind of interesting to see.
Infrastructure investment. It's much cheaper to print a QR code or put out an RFID tag than it is to deploy cameras throughout a store and keep an eye on everything. I mean, I do think it is a journey, right? We heard from some of the companies that are leading the charge towards this unified commerce future, but I think we also heard from a number of companies that this is a very long process. And so on the convenience session last year, BP talked about how they're still kind of working on breaking down silos to kind of convince that their store team that e-com is a net plus, not a competitive threat. Who else said something like that? In our session on the store workforce first thing this morning, when not too many people were there, but the people who were there, we surveyed them, and they kind of were uncertain about how well prepared their workforces were to kind of support this kind of a customer journey that starts online and shifts offline. So it's definitely still a work in process, but something we'll be looking at closely going forward. Next, I think we want to talk about purpose and leadership. I think that came up, again, kind of many times over the course of the last couple of days. Krystina, any big moments that stood out to you as far as a leader really embracing purpose?
Yeah, I would say my conversation with Soraya from Diageo was one that stood out to me just because I had the opportunity to connect with her when we were not on stage, and just she's a very authentic person, and I think the word authenticity gets thrown around quite a bit, but I think especially when you're a leader and you have a very, very large team and you have very high expectations because you are a multinational, multi-billion-dollar business, it's very hard, right, to sort of lead in that way and make people have a human connection to you. But when she was talking about how their engagement surveys are going up and she's, embracing some of the mistakes that she made and using those as learning lessons for her team so that they feel safe to come to her when they're encountering challenges, having those sort of open dialogues about challenges that you're facing and can't quite solve on your own are actually how you make progress. So that was one that really stood out to me. And then I think, in addition to that, and she spoke a little bit about gender equity as well, because Diageo has made huge strides there. I think your conversation with Ulrika and just the fact that IKEA has hit the 50-50 gender equity in their senior leadership team is an incredibly impressive stat. I think probably one thing that she didn't play up enough is when you think about how global that business is and the fact that they are in some markets where that is incredibly hard to do and sometimes, quite frankly, not even measured is a huge feat. It was a little bit depressing to hear that it took 20 years to get there. So I really, truly hope that that is something that they were really on the front end of, and hopefully other companies will be able to get there much faster by being aware of this and sort of creating programs and mentorship opportunities to allow this to happen much more quickly.
Yeah, I thought this morning's session on purpose was really, really good too. I wasn't able to stay for the whole thing, but I think we heard there the idea that purpose is going from something that you do because it's good to something that like you embody because it's what your brand really stands for. It's what, and maybe in a lot of cases it's what your customers increasingly expect. Ben Black from Verlinvest was one of the speakers on that session, and our moderator asked him, kind of why invest in brands that are embracing purpose. And he had like a very buttoned up, like I'm sure he gets that question a lot. Like his answer was, 1, purpose-driven brands attract better quality talent. 2, 70% of consumers say that they're more willing to pay for purpose-led brands. And 3, it's super important to millennials and Gen Z. And so if you're at all thinking about younger consumers as customers of your brand, you really need to have a purpose story. Not more than a story about purpose, you really need to have purpose as part of what your brand does. And I thought
what's the term that's coming out now for people who are sort of faking their purpose and sustainability goals? Green
hushing.
Green hushing. Oh, it's the opposite.
Green hushing is sort of really interesting. We didn't really talk about it too much at Shoptalk, but that's the idea that you're doing the right thing, but you don't talk about it because there are certain segments of the world that like if you try to do what you may feel right, they disagree and disagree loudly on social media. So I thought Ulrika actually had a very good statement about that, which is that IKEA Inca Group doesn't just go and embrace the latest cause or the latest thing. They think very hard about what social issues most tightly fit with their brand, and they're very thoughtful about that, and they stick to those. They don't just like I say, they don't just go and chase whatever seems like it's trendy for social likes or whatever. They do what's really kind of close to their heart, and they believe that regardless of what people may say.
Yeah. It's important. We've seen a lot of companies take missteps in this area, so if you're going to say something, you better mean it.
Yep. And again, I guess I'll come back to the Zalando conversation where he said, shoppers are increasingly socially and environmentally conscious, and so we need to too. Maybe one last point about greenwashing. I think Shai Eisenman from Bubble kind of pointed out that it's sort of easy to kind of tell a story that seems like it might be, in her case, or in that case, environmentally conscious, but may not be. You really kind of need to look at the science and be willing to kind of share, be transparent about the science behind your claim. Her thing was about refillable like cosmetics and shampoo and soap bottles that like refillable seems like such a natural no-brainer. It's got to be greener than a bottle that you throw away, but you need to use that reusable bottle 28 times before it's environmentally greener than the throwaway bottle. So a consumer may not realize quite what they're in for to be truly green.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up because if anyone was in Deborah Weinswig's session on Web3 specific to the supply chain, she was actually making a sort of controversial point that the fast fashion companies that are under a lot of heat these days for their practices and sort of what they mean for the planet, she was actually making the argument that because a lot of their fashion designs are virtual and then produced on demand, that they're perhaps not as big of a negative on the planet as some people have made them out to be. So really interesting to sort of hear a conflicting viewpoint on that.
Right, and certainly on the main stage, having both Otrium and Thread up on the first day, and then Matt Smart Potatoes on the second day, all kind of focused on waste and the fact that we do generally produce too much as a retail industry, but there are ways to kind of find a home for the overproduction that don't involve landfills. So reason for hope, I think.
Yes.
Moving on, changing corporate relationships. I'm just going to sit back and say retail media networks, and in case you haven't heard enough about them, Ben can talk some more.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk too much. I feel like I've talked a lot about retail media today, and there's a real reason for that. it's only going to grow. So for those of you who are able to join in the zeitgeist, the stat that is forecast to be almost the same size as entire European television advertising spend in just 2 years is, I think, fascinating. Every conversation that I've been in with a retailer of scale, they've talked about we need to invest in our retail media, we see opportunities. So there is absolutely no doubt that it is going away. I think we have two really important conversations to have about retail media. One's around standardization. So how do we make it more efficient? The number of different platforms, the lack of advertising standards. Joe, I know it's a world that you come from and have a lot of experience in. It's a Wild West territory, and it's very hard, and that makes the return on spend and the investment really inefficient. So it's one thing saying retail media is great because it's attributable and you get the data. Well, if you're losing that efficiency because of the amount of time you're reprogramming, reprocessing, that comes against it. So one of the things is standardization. I think it's really interesting hearing both from Ahold Delhaize and from Carrefour about the need of standardization, desired standardization. I think there's lots of retailers who say we need to standardize, and we think everyone should follow us. That's going to be interesting, see how that plays out. So I think there is absolutely opportunities for pan-industry bodies to come together and see what happens in this space. And that's going to be really interesting to see. The second is how you make it genuinely value add for the customer. And for any brand investing, how well can you understand the uniqueness of the audience? Because there will come a point that every brand owner will stop investing if it can't have the proof points. And it takes a whole different skill set to get those proof points.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be really interesting to see how good do the retailers get at being able to talk about and sell their retail media offerings as a value add. And I think we're starting to see a recognition of that. I think some really interesting conversations. But if you can't do that, nobody's going to invest. And yep. I think that's going to be the one thing. But it's going to move fast. Retail media, there's some great insider intelligence. If anybody wants to really get deep into the topic, insider intelligence is a great place to go. And they're showing the pace of development that is sort of 3 or 4 times the pace of the digital marketing boom. So how our AMNs look now will be really different in 6 months, will be really different in 12 months.
For sure. You talked about kind of value for the customer. The customer, in this case, both the brand that's buying some advertising space and the consumer, the shopper that's seeing the ad. And I thought one of the less expected, at least to me, retail media stories that were told on stage was from Unibail Rodamco Westfield. They own shopping malls, and so not a retailer per se, but they have all of this space that all of this foot traffic goes by as people are going to the malls. And I think some of the examples they talked about around the kinds of data streams that they use, like is there a big queue at Nespresso? And if there isn't, then let's show a Nespresso ad, letting people know this is a great time to go get a coffee, and like really actually measurably driving foot traffic, helping a consumer who like needs a shot of caffeine, like I sort of do right now, to know when it's a good time.
I mean, one of the really interesting things, is how do you take the principles of retail media networks, i.e. unlocking personalization, attributable full funnel, and put them into an offline environment. Now, there's a number of retailers that are talking about integrating offline into their retail media, but what they're really saying is, I'm taking my existing trade marketing stuff and putting it as part of my retail media brand. Not, I'm offering genuine personalization and attributable sales through my retail media network in a physical environment. And how the technologies piece together to enable that is one of the really big things, because it's not happening yet.
Yeah. Both John Lewis and Coca-Cola talked about like what budget is this coming from as retail media networks grow the way they're forecast to. Yeah. So is it the media budget? Is it just the trade budget? Is it new money, or is it old money that's just kind of moving from one bucket already being spent with the retailer to a different bucket? So really interesting to watch. Any other things we want to talk about around how relationships in the industry are changing?
Well, I just sort of feel like everyone's selling something to everyone these days, and I think you've sort of made that comment in your session, Ben. It's so interesting as content curators. We are always, as we mentioned, on the lookout for companies who are going to share real insights with our audience. Make sure it's not a sales pitch, and it sort of feels like every deck you look at these days, you have to make sure no one's trying to sell something to people in the audience. And so I'm sure you guys are feeling that as well in your business. It sort of feels like, what kind of partnership is this going to be? Are you trying to sell me something? The dynamics are just very quickly changing, and So I think that's just another seismic shift that's going to continue to accelerate.
Yeah. I will say our session this morning on direct-to-consumer and wholesale and kind of how different brands are navigating, kind of how much should we be going direct to our consumers versus working with retailers. It was refreshing. Like in my notes at the start of that session, I titled my note document like D2C versus wholesale, because that's the way I've thought about it for many years now. And really it was a much more like these are synergistic, kind of like omni-channel. It shouldn't be your online channel versus your store. It should be about how those two things complement one another. I think we're hearing more and more brands finding ways to make their D2C offering really complementary to their relationship with retailers, and in a way that retailers can get behind as well. So I think that's positive. There's always going to be friction there, and there's always going to be like how much should we be in which channel. But I do think it's interesting to hear about them being very complementary to one another.
Yeah, and I think one of the best things that we heard at our US show was D2C as a channel, not a strategy, and it feels like that sentiment has really made its way over to this side of the pond.
Around the world.
I guess there's one last thing. One of the things that I'm constantly thinking about and constantly looking out is this idea that the arrival of retail media networks turns that relationship on its head. So what does that mean in your JBPs? What does that mean in your commercial relationships? Do you separate, build a different division? And I thought it was a really interesting point on this for those of you who are in the Lime Studio session with Elodie from Carrefour, which was a great conversation. 20 minutes of insight just being hit at you, so it took a breath out of that one. But one of the things that she said was, in Carrefour, they have a communications pyramid. And they've just brought this in. And at the very top of the pyramid is the shopper. And at the very, very bottom of the pyramid is the executive committee. So what it's saying is that everybody in the business, you make your decision based on doing the right thing for the shopper. The very last thing you should be thinking about is, what does my ex-com member want to hear? Which I thought was really, really interesting.
That's the best depiction of being customer-centric I've heard of in a while.
What she then said is, historically, for Carrefour, their CPG suppliers would have been even below where it is on the pyramid.
In the basement.
A brave and bold thing to say, and for those of you who've had the pleasure of selling into Carrefour, maybe not a huge surprise. But what she did say was, that's old. We can't do that anymore. In a world where we're building media networks, where digital and data sharing is so important, we have to have collaborative relationships. Now, trading relationships in French grocery are very tough at the moment, and it's a journey, but it's already saying this is the direction of travel. We have to have a different form of relationships with our suppliers. So the idea that it will completely go on its head, we're a long way from that, and Simon Miles was making that point very clearly. But there is definitely a journey that it will change, and therefore the competencies required to sell into and buy from will also evolve, and that's going to be really interesting.
Great. Well, we're down to our last 8 minutes, and we have 2 topics to go over, so we're going to have to, and I want to save some time for questions from you all. So we'll have to go into a bit of a lightning round. I did think there were several interesting comments about the investment environment over the last several days. Maybe I'll paraphrase them by saying, I think it's all about looking at companies that really kind of do add directly to their customers' bottom lines sooner rather than later. Companies that are being very prudent and very aggressive about careful about their costs and their path to profitability. But it is definitely not a time to cut all investment entirely in new technologies, new partnerships. Anything else quick to add there?
I guess the one thing I'll say is from my conversation with Emma Ellis, she was sort of talking about if you start finding efficiencies, then you can start investing again. So actually it's very prudent to start finding those cost savings so that then you have a little bit more money to invest in the more forward-looking things. And I thought that was a really great way to think about it.
Great. And then the last thing I had on my list of things for us to chat about is just kind of all the other technologies that were really kind of cool and interesting. I think it is interesting to hear about Web3 technologies now that the metaverse hype has died down. And I think there are several real applications of those sorts of technologies that
we give the metaverse such a hard time. The sessions on on augmented and virtual reality and NFTs were 2 of the busiest sessions that I walked into. So clearly there's still a ton of interest here. Really interesting also just to hear about the different ways that companies are still experimenting with these things. Mars was actually talking about how they're tying this into their ESG initiatives, where you can actually get an NFT, and as they meet their sustainability goals as it pertains to preserving coral reefs, the NFT will actually grow. So I don't know, one of my big takeaways was a lot of the things that we've shut down maybe recently still feel like they have legs, I would add live stream to that. Coming into this, it felt like in the US, everyone was just over it. Everyone's talking about, on-demand shoppable video, which of course we heard about that here as well. But hearing about the pivots that Printemps made to make their live stream offering work, we've seen companies like Zhao in the grocery space, which is making, shoppable videos in the recipe space. His argument was, okay, well, a lot of times those don't succeed because who's going to make fried chicken and waffles and pour syrup all over them every day? No, that's not what people are actually adding to their cart on a daily basis. So maybe make these recipes more realistic and people will convert. So just kind of hearing about the little tweaks to these models that we'd written off has been really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the final build on the metaverse is taking those technologies that are sit within Web3 and thinking about where they can be applied to make a retail organization work better, which is a whole topic that we don't have time to even scratch the surface on now, but we have worked with our partners at Coresight to do a piece of original content. You can find out more on ours and their websites about, but it really talks about, you take those building blocks that underpin the metaverse, which is blockchain and augmented reality, and you start applying some of those into a retail environment in the supply chain operations side to make, whether that's in digital twins or whether that's in store location, the ability to automate replenishment, the requirements for replenishment, stock taking. There is a lot that these technologies can have the potential to do that we just not scratching the surface of yet. Yeah. So I think there's another hype cycle to come, but it's more about
we're going to drive
how we use that technology than the customer ending facing metaverse per se.
That's really, really interesting. Okay, in the interest of time, we have one more survey question for you all before we wrap up, and that is, what do you want to see next year? And there's a variety of different things here. Some of them are topically focused, some of them are kind of ways to arrange a session, but take a look, see, and let us know, kind of if there are any things on this list that especially stand out as things you'd like to see here in Barcelona next year. One more thing around tech as people are voting, I'll give a quick shout out to the winners of our Startup Pitch Early Stage Tech Solution Competition. Associate AI is a large language model chat that helps customers find products that are ideal for them. Their founder's example in the pitch was you can type into a chatbot, I want a flapper dress, I want a Great Gatsby style dress. And what search engine knows what a Great Gatsby dress looks like, but theirs does. And so they can find things that match that. And then the other winner was Hiron Technologies, which is way on the other end, supply chain focused, helping manufacturers order the right amount of fabric based on likely demand for a purple blouse versus a white blouse in this size versus that size. So two extremely different sorts of technology solutions, but both, again, kind of hitting very much on the what's been in the air the last several days. Yeah. In terms of what people want to see next year, it's looking like consumer behavior is of great interest.
Right.
Digital, it's interesting to me. Digital was very popular in Las Vegas as well. So e-commerce as distinct from omni-channel unified commerce being something of great interest, and then what's going on around the world. So
thank you.
Well, that bodes very well. Yeah, thanks for voting. And then, so here's what people said in the United States a few weeks ago. Again, consumer behavior, super interesting.
This is tracking very similarly across.
Consistent,
yeah.
yes.
Very interesting.
And then lastly, I'd be really happy to hear from you. If anybody has any questions for us before we wrap up, if you have any other thoughts you'd like to share about what you experienced the last few days, there will be a very detailed survey that all Shoptalk Europe attendees will get in the coming week. Please do fill it out because we take that feedback very, very, very seriously. But I'll open the floor if anybody has a question or a comment.
I think that means we did everything perfectly. There was no flaw in the content.
I think it means everybody wants to get the bar.
None of us really got to eat any of the food. So if anybody really liked the paella versus the bao and noodles versus the tacos, this would be a good time to say that because we could put in a good plug.
I think it's time to let good people go, Joe.
Yes, let's wrap things up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining us. And see you next year, 3rd to 5th of June, here again.
Thank you.